630.
7:07 on a Monday morning majority. Brian, even Tony Blankley in the house this morning.
Good morning.
Joe DiGenova, well, actually will be here tomorrow, joins us now, former U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Morning, Joe.
Good morning, Brian. Morning, Tony.
Good morning, Joe.
We spent a lot of time last year talking about Arizona and their controversial immigration law. It was last week that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals turned down an appeal by Governor Jan Brewer. You know, the Justice Department is suing, saying that it violates the Constitution because enforcing immigration law is a federal issue. Are you surprised by the ruling from the Ninth Circuit, and what does this mean that ultimately will still wind up in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I was not surprised. There is a colorable question as to whether or not a state could enact the particulars of this legislation, and so it was inevitable that the Ninth Circuit would not prevent the stay from staying. So nothing surprising going to the Supreme Court. Maybe Virginia will get it there a little faster, but I think the Supreme Court is probably going to wait for the courts of appeals to issue rulings.
Okay.
Joe, let me go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is the president reversing himself on signing statements by the president. As you remember, he was adamant that it was unconstitutional when George W. was doing it, and now he's done it on, of all things, the power of Congress to deny appropriations. How big a deal is it for the president to redefine the power of the presidency in this way?
Well, this is big both politically and legally. Politically, it's a complete about-face on the signing statement, just as it was a complete about-face to vote against the debt ceiling and now be in favor of it as president. The underlying politics of this are, of course, that being a candidate is one thing, having to run the country is another thing. And the types of decisions you have to make as president are different than those of a candidate. But legally, this is a much more interesting question. He says that he's not going to obey a specific piece of legislation with regard to who he can employ and not employ and what their powers are in the executive branch because it violates his powers under the Constitution as the head of the executive branch. This is quite remarkable because it sets up literally a constitutional confrontation if he seeks to fill one of the already vacated czar slots or if he creates a new one. And we will get litigation out of this, constitutional litigation.
I was going to ask you how that comes about. I mean, this almost sounds, without the moral estimate, this almost sounds like an Nixonian confrontation of the executive branch power versus Congress.
Yes, it is. This is quite a remarkable set too. And what's going to happen is he's going to find himself pitted against a large part of Democratic Party majorities in both houses because it's the Democrats who set up the construct that this was unconstitutional during the George W. Bush administration, and part of the beautiful agony and the ecstasy of this will be watching members of the minority and party in the House how they're going to set to on this. I would think that you'll see hearings in the House of Representatives, in the Judiciary Committee at a minimum, over the constitutional authority to do this, and you will, of course, see the usual array of impeachment resolutions.
Do you see any path to have it go into court as opposed to simply holding hearings?
The issue will be who has standing to sue, and probably nobody. I think standing will be, in other words, for our listeners, standing it means that you have to have a visible, viable, violated legal right in order to file a lawsuit under the Constitution. You have to be injured somehow. It isn't clear who's injured by this. One of the czars could be injured if they couldn't get the job, but they won't be suing over
Probably
it.
Won't litigate.
And the president and the House have political and constitutional interests which could be litigated. It could be that the House of Representatives could file a lawsuit in United States District Court seeking a declaratory judgment against the President of the United States. That is a possible source of litigation. The House of Representatives itself suing the president.
Could a taxpayer sue, saying, hey, this is my money?
No, generally speaking, being a taxpayer does not give you the legal right. That's not considered sufficient standing, although there is a big constitutional debate now going on about whether or not this old case law from the Supreme Court saying that just because you're a taxpayer doesn't mean you have the right to sue.
Right.
They're beginning to think that may not be good law, and that's starting to work its way up through the circuit courts.
Didn't the Supreme Court recently make a tight interpretation of standing?
It did. It did. It tightened standing recently, and what it's trying to do is keep cases out of courts. The Supreme Court is on a major role trying to get cases out of federal courts and into state courts, and to try and clean up the federal docket. But way back in the 70s, the Supreme Court, along with the D.C. Circuit, created all sorts of standing rights for do-gooder organizations like the Wilderness Society or Sierra Club to sue in environmental cases, giving them a strange standing capability. And now that is being questioned. So we may see some rollbacks here in the area of who can sue the federal government.
All right, I just want to back up a second for some people who might not understand what happened. Essentially, during the budget deal that was negotiated between Republicans and Democrats, the $38 billion worth of cuts, they defunded the White House's czar budget, essentially, correct?
Yes.
So,
correct.
And the president has signed a statement essentially saying, no, I'm going to keep my czars and still use the money to pay for czars.
Yeah, he claimed he had the inherent executive authority to hire who he wanted, and that Congress did not have the legal power to defund an executive branch activity.
Now, these signing statements, which he said that George Bush was wrongdoing over 1,000 times. Now, the White House has pointed to a 2007 article that the president gave before he was the president with the Boston Globe, essentially saying that if he were the president, then he would use signing statements to, quote, nullify or undermine congressional instructions as enacted into law. Does that meet this
That's not
criteria?
what we've got his language expressly.
Well, I think as a matter of politics, it doesn't meet any standard. But that doesn't matter, because when you're president and you decide you're right, you'll do whatever you want to do and say whatever you want to say to preserve presidential prerogatives. Now, this is an old battle that goes back to the beginning of the Republic, which is the battle between the president and the Congress. I mean, we were talking about this over the weekend when we were that my wife Victoria Tunsing and I were doing a study on piracy, and we were watching how Thomas Jefferson, our pacifist president, decided he was going to go to war while Congress was in recess when he sent a paramilitary operation over to Tripoli to stop the Barbary pirates.
Yeah.
He did it when Congress was in recess. And the president is simply historically staking out an area of presidential prerogative because he's been told, if you don't do this, you may be giving up some power you may need at some other place. So this is tricky stuff.
Yeah.
But again, I see litigation down the road on this.
But politically, it's bad for him because it's like, oh, well, we agreed, we came together, we made cuts, and now I'm going to say, well, those cuts really didn't apply to me in my budget.
I think the optics of this politically are pretty bad for the president.
Before we let you go, I want to ask you about these air traffic controllers that keep falling asleep. And you said when the first one that broke and the guy at Reagan National, he fell asleep, and I said, this guy's got to be fired, and you said he's not going to be fired. Why can't they be fired? I mean, why can't the FAA say, if you fall asleep on the job, you're done, end of story?
Union contracts. All of these folks are members of the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and the federal government, through collective bargaining agreements, has negotiated certain work rules for them, and among them is that you can't be fired for certain things, but until you go through a process. In other words, they can be fired, but there is a rather lengthy process of discipline which has to be gone through under the collective bargaining agreement. Now, that collective bargaining agreement can be changed. And if that is the case, I don't think we're going to see it in this administration. I don't think the Obama administration is going to change this, but Ray LaHood may have enough pull, because he is from Illinois, as you recall, to get them to do that once this particular contract is up. But it's all about work rules and collective bargaining agreements. You can suspend people, but they have to continue to be paid, and you cannot fire them until there has been a complete...
That's the best of all worlds. You get paid, and you don't have to even pretend to be working.
You can sleep all you want.
You get exactly what you were doing when you were sleeping. You get paid for doing nothing.
All right, Joe. Good to talk to you. We'll see you tomorrow, okay?